Shadow Trade Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds, thank you for joining us for The Real Me. This is an interview format where we try and dispel some myths, and my preconception about you when you came into Parliament was because of your double-barrelled name is that you were posh, but that's not the case, is it?
No, and the double-barrelled surname comes about because my late mother, Pam, decided that there was no reason why I couldn't have her maiden name as well as my father's surname. So when I was named, I was given both names. So I became Nick Thomas-Symonds, and actually that name does mean a great deal to me because whenever I hear my name called in the House of Commons, I'm called as Nick Thomas-Symonds, and it always reminds me of my mother because she's the person that gave me that name.
What did your mum do?
My mother worked in a factory in my hometown of Blanavon. She had that job up until just after I was born, and then she gave up the job. She never went back to work after I was born, but she had a profound influence on me and on my politics.
And your dad, what did he do?
So my father was a steel worker. He started off as an apprentice in Lamworth Steelworks, worked his way up, became an industrial chemist, and both he and my mother undoubtedly have shaped my politics.
So you become an Oxford tutor, aged 21. You're an academic, you're a historian, you are an author, you were a barrister. Very different worlds to the one in which you grew up in. Is there one of those worlds where you felt most out of place?
I never felt out of place, but always you do occasionally have bits of imposter syndrome where you step aside from yourself and then you look at yourself, you look at the things that you're doing on a daily basis. And I think when I was a barrister in particular, when I started as a barrister, you do a range of law when you start before you eventually specialise. And I can remember representing people when I did criminal law for 2 or 3 years, and you get this remarkable window into other people's lives. You see this human drama in the courtroom of how people's lives are, the things that people do, and you do always think back to your own experiences, and you do sometimes have this little part of you, particularly when you walked out of court at the end of the day, that thinks, was that actually me? So
you lost your mum on New Year's Day in 2018. How did you deal with the grief of losing your mum?
It was an extraordinarily difficult period. She'd been ill for a couple of years with cancer, so that was a really hard period. Obviously, I'm very lucky to represent my home constituency in Parliament, but it meant me being away, as I always am during the weeks, Monday to Wednesday, Monday to Thursday, depending on the parliamentary business that week. But whenever I could get back to spend time with her, I used to take her, for example, to chemotherapy appointments when she was having that treatment. And I came home from Parliament for the Christmas recess in 2017. And she was very, very ill by that point. And that was the last couple of weeks of her life. But although she was very ill, we were still able to talk right up until the very, very final days. What really helped me, oddly enough, though, was actually the parliamentary crisis that was going on at that time, because it was a hung parliament, which meant that every single vote mattered. You couldn't simply have time away from Parliament. And my mother died on the New Year's Day of 2018. Her funeral was on the 15th, and the reason I remember is it was precisely 2 weeks later. But that night, there was a series of votes in Parliament. I had no option but to be there because some votes were going, there were tiny margins. And so, although in one way, having been to the funeral that day, having this churn of emotions all day, in some ways it was difficult to get on the train to come back. But in others, because I had to do it. I had no option but to do it. Actually having my time taken up with that intense parliamentary business did actually help, because I had no time to sit, to think. I just had to get on with it. And that, in a curious way, was helpful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people relate to that. You are a dad of 3 children. In 2016, your wife gave birth to William. At 7 weeks old, he was rushed to hospital with chronic renal failure as he was born with just 1 kidney. Did you ever fear you would lose William?
We did have that fear, and that period now, when I look back at it, I just wonder and marvel at how my wife Rebecca and myself ever got through it. And there's part of it now that just doesn't seem very real when I look back. But when he was taken ill initially, he originally went to a local hospital. I was in London. I remember waking up early morning in London. I had, I think it was about 27 missed calls from my wife. So I saw it, panicked, immediately jumped on the train, went straight back to South Wales. He was taken by ambulance to a specialist hospital, wonderful, wonderful hospital, by the way, Noah's Ark in Cardiff. Absolutely remarkable care that he had. But he had an operation that was a life-saving operation. It took place in the early hours of the morning. The hospital had to find a specialist surgeon to do it and to actually get her out of bed. She lived in the north of Cardiff, to come and do this operation. And it wasn't a case of having a conversation before the operation of, do you give consent and do you understand the risks and all these kind of things when you ordinarily have an operation. Her words have always stuck with me. She said, "I think I can do it." And in fairness to her, she did. It turned out to be something of turning a corner, because it took William out of the life danger that he was in. But there were to be 4 more major operations. So he had 5 operations in the first 6 months of his life. It was an incredibly difficult period, as you can imagine, because I've got 2 other children, Matilda and Florence, my daughters. So we had to find a way of Rebecca, my wife, virtually living in the hospital with William, looking after the 2 girls at home where I live in Aberystwyth in my constituency, but also trying to represent my constituents in London. Relied on our family an awful lot to get through it, but it was this extraordinarily intense period that looking back now, I do wonder how we managed to do it.
It sounds really tough. And you talked about the difficulty of getting the surgeon out of bed. Now, we are about to see more nurses' strikes. We are seeing junior doctor strikes. If William was in that position, you would contemplate, any parent would contemplate, would William have made it if there had been strikes during that moment? Provided
there are the derogations in place. And this is why it's so important, and we've been saying about this, I've been saying this, other members of the Shadow Cabinet saying this in recent weeks, that we completely understand the frustration of our brilliant NHS staff, not just where they are at the moment with the cost of living, but the last 13 years of squeezed investment in the NHS. But try to make sure that those derogations are in place.
Derogations, just explain what you mean.
So what I mean by that is where there are life-threatening situations that staff are still provided. And I think keeping those derogations in place, making sure that where there are these very serious situations, there are still staff available, it's also one of the reasons, I think, why public opinion has remained so strong in favour of our NHS staff and a fair deal for them. OK, so you shadow Kemi Badenoch, the Trade Secretary, and she's really happy at the moment. She is hailing the pact with 11 Asian and Pacific countries as fantastic news for British consumers and companies. Is it well done to Kemi from you? Well, look, I always like to see new markets opened up for our brilliant exporters. I am so proud of our exporters right across the United Kingdom. I've got an exporter in my constituency in Torvine, Frog Bikes, that supplies the US cycling team. You know, we've got exporters all across the country that are doing these great, iconic things that we should be really, really proud of. So, of course, I want to see new markets. As ever, though, with this government, the devil is in the detail. I've watched other deals lauded as wonderful. Take the Australia deal, for example. Then as soon as ministers are out of office, they tell us how terrible they are. So George Eustace, who of course was in the cabinet, leaves the cabinet and says that the Australia deal just isn't up to it. The Prime Minister, when he was temporarily out of office, told us it was very one-sided. So experience tells me that when this government lauds trade deals as fantastic, we should always wait a few days and look at what they've actually conceded.
OK. Finally, but I was reading a speech that you made about the next Labour government establishing rules to ensure that trade negotiators have binding responsibilities to help deliver economic opportunities in their trade negotiations throughout the UK to all our wonderful towns and cities outside of nations, outside of the southeast of England. Tell me how that would work in practice.
So there's two really important aspects to this. The first is the duty that is on our negotiators, both in the period they're negotiating, to regularly report back to me as the Trade Secretary as to the progress they've made and the impact it's having, but also when you actually get to complete a trade deal. I don't want to see just statistics about GDP for the whole country. I mean, we just mentioned the CPTPP, for example, as the acronym that it's known by, where the government modelling says we'll have 0.08% to our GDP over the next 10 years. I don't want to just see a statistic like that. What does that mean for people up and down the country? What does it mean for their communities? What does it mean for opportunity across the country? And if my trade negotiators come back to me and they can't give me that information, then there will be changes in the way the negotiation is taking place, and we won't be completing deals that don't have that benefit across the country. But secondly, my plan is to actually create as well what we've called climate export hubs in every nation and region of the UK. We have a wonderfully inventive people. And you think of the emerging climate technologies, the carbon capture and storage, so many other things, offshore, onshore wind, all these things. We can lead the world in that, both in what we're doing here, but in exporting that technology to the world. And in recent weeks, I was very proud to announce the one that is going to be created in Wales alongside Vaughan Gething, and I will look to do that for every nation and region of the country. Trade can benefit the whole country, but you need a government leading that.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, we did personal, we did politics, and we did where the personal meets the political. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.